somewhere in the tangled lowlands of what is now Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and southern Mexico, the forest is still quietly digesting a civilization. Beneath roots and vines lie the remains of dozens of great cities: Tikal, Calakmul, Copán, Palenque, Caracal, places that once held hundreds of thousands of people, towering limestone pyramids painted in blood-red plaster, plazas crowded with markets, ball courts echoing with the thud of a rubber ball, and royal courts obsessed with astronomy, warfare, and dynasty. And then, over the span of roughly a century, it all came apart. Not conquered by a foreign army, not erased in a single dramatic event, but hollowed out from within, city after city falling silent, one after another, like a chain of lights switching off across a dark landscape. This is the story of that unraveling, the classic Maya collapse, one of the most studied and most debated disappearances in archaeology. It's a story with no single villain and no single cause. Instead, it's a story about the limits of growth, the fragility of complex systems, and what happens when a civilization pushes its environment right up to the edge, and then the climate stops cooperating. A civilization built on hard ground. To understand why the Maya collapse happened, you first have to understand just how difficult the land they settled really was. The Yucatan Peninsula sits on a shelf of porous limestone, riddled with cavities like a sponge. Rainfall doesn't collect into rivers here. It drains straight down through the rock into underground channels, leaving the surface dry for much of the year. The only reliable water sources were natural sinkholes called cenotes and hand-dug reservoirs that the Maya lined with plaster to stop the water leaking away. Every drop had to be managed deliberately, stored carefully, and rationed through the dry season. The soil was thin, often just a few inches deep before hitting bedrock, and it exhausted quickly under cultivation. There were no oxen, no horses, no large pack animals of any kind to pull plows or carry heavy loads. The largest animal in the region was the tapir, which was hunted, not domesticated. Everything the Maya built, from monumental pyramids to everyday pottery, was made using stone tools. They never developed bronze or iron working, and metal tools only appear in the archaeological record very late and in limited quantities. They didn't use wheels for transport either, despite understanding the concept. Wheeled toys have been found in Maya burials, but never wheeled vehicles, likely because there was no draft animal to pull them, and the jungle terrain made wheels impractical anyway. And yet, working against all of this, the Maya built one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. Beginning as early as 2000 BCE with the domestication of maize, beans, squash, and cacao, Maya society grew steadily more complex over the following centuries. By the Classic period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, dozens of independent city-states had emerged across the lowlands, each ruled by a king who claimed divine authority, each competing for trade, territory, and prestige, and each linked to the others through a shared language family, a shared religious cosmology, and a shared writing system. The rivalry that shaped an era. No single king ever unified the Maya world into one empire. Instead, the Classic period looks something like the city-states of ancient Greece or Renaissance Italy, a landscape of competing courts bound together by culture but constantly maneuvering against one another for dominance. Of these, two cities stand out above the rest: Tikal and Calakmul. Tikal, in what is now northern Guatemala, was for long stretches the most powerful city in the Maya lowlands. Its temples rose over 60 meters into the canopy, capped with enormous stone masks of gods, and painted a vivid red that would have been visible for miles. Archaeologists estimate its urban core held tens of thousands of people, with its wider sphere of influence reaching perhaps 500,000. Tikal's rise was accelerated by contact with Teotihuacan, the enormous city in central Mexico, over 1,500 kilometers away, that dominated trade routes across Mesoamerica at the time. Carved monuments at Tikal show foreign warriors present at a royal coronation in the 4th century, and tombs from this era contain green obsidian that could only have come from Teotihuacan's controlled sources. Whether this relationship involved outright conquest, a political marriage, or something more like a trade partnership backed by military threat is still debated, but its effect is not. Under this influence, Tikal became an imperial power, and neighboring cities began referring to its king using a title that essentially meant overlord. Calakmul, further north, took a different path. Rather than compete with Tikal head-on, its rulers, who called themselves the Lords of the Snake, and used a serpent glyph as their emblem, spent generations quietly building a coalition of allied and vassal states surrounding their rival, slowly cutting off Tikal's trade routes and encircling it. It was less a war than a decades-long siege of diplomacy and pressure. Calakmul's inscriptions also stand out for another reason. Unlike Tikal's, which focus almost entirely on kings, Calakmul's monuments regularly credit queens as co-rulers, suggesting a somewhat different structure of political legitimacy, one that traced its authority back to older, pre-classic Maya traditions. The rivalry between these two cities and their networks of allies played out over centuries, through what the Maya called Star Wars, a term drawn from a specific glyph depicting a star raining fire onto the earth, referring to campaigns of unusually total and destructive warfare, as opposed to the smaller, more ritualized raids that were far more common. In 562 CE, this rivalry produced one of the most consequential events in Tikal's history. The city was besieged and overrun by an alliance backed by Calakmul, its monuments smashed, its royal statues defaced, its king likely captured and executed. For the next 100 years, Tikal's growth stalled almost completely, no major monuments, reduced population growth, a visible dip in the archaeological record. It would eventually recover and even reassert dominance by the mid-8th century. But the long war of attrition between these two superpowers had, in a sense, been rehearsing the very kind of systemic breakdown that would soon engulf the entire region, just on a smaller, localized scale. Reading the silence, what the monuments tell us. One of the strangest and most useful tools archaeologists have for tracking the Maya collapse is something almost mundane: the dating of stone monuments. Maya kings routinely commissioned carved stele stone pillars marking significant dates, using their sophisticated calendar system, which was capable of tracking time across enormous spans, far beyond anything needed for practical record-keeping. By counting how many dated monuments were erected in a given city in a given year, researchers can build a rough proxy for that city's prosperity, political stability, and confidence in its own future. And what that record shows is a civilization at the height of its power, followed by an extraordinarily rapid unraveling. At Copán, for example, the number of monuments erected per year rose steadily through the 6th and 7th centuries, and by the middle of the 8th century, construction was happening at a scale never seen before. Then, within about 50 years, it stopped almost entirely. City by city across the lowlands, the same pattern repeats. A peak in construction sometime in the mid to late 700s, followed by a steep decline, and then silence. The order in which cities fell silent is itself informative. It began in the southwest, around the Usumacinta River, in the final years of the 8th century. From there it spread northeast in a rough wave over the following century. Calakmul's last dated monument comes around 810 CE, Copán's around 822, and Tikal, which had briefly experienced a renaissance in the mid-700s, complete with a burst of temple building, finally goes silent around 889. The very last known long count inscription anywhere in the Maya lowlands comes from the remote city of Tanana, dated to 909 CE. After that, nothing. No new stele, no new palaces, no new dynasties recorded, not because the Maya people vanished, but because the political and religious system that had sustained monumental kingship for half a millennium had ceased to function. What's genuinely eerie about this record is what's missing from it. There are no inscriptions warning of disaster, no laments carved into stone, no signs that anyone at the time understood they were living through the end of an era. The artistic quality of Maya work doesn't decline in these final decades either. The carving remains skilled and elaborate right up until it simply stops. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something the Maya elite were documenting for posterity. It's possible they didn't fully grasp the scale of what was unfolding until it was already too late to record it, or that the very system of recording history, tied as it was to royal legitimacy, broke down at the same moment as the monarchy itself. The pressures beneath the surface. So what actually happened? Modern archaeology points not to a single catastrophe, but to a convergence of stresses that had been building for generations, each one making the others worse. The first is simple demographic pressure. Maya agriculture, based primarily on maize supplemented with beans and squash, was nutritionally adequate but labor-intensive and relatively low-yield compared to grain agriculture in other parts of the ancient world. Estimates suggest a single Maya farmer using traditional methods could produce enough surplus to support perhaps 5 or 6 other people beyond his own family. A modest ratio compared to the vastly higher productivity of modern industrial agriculture. And yet, by the 8th century, the population of the Maya lowlands had reached levels that some researchers estimate in the millions, with individual cities like Tikal supporting population densities that rivaled pre-industrial cities anywhere in the world. That kind of population can only be sustained if the agricultural system underneath it is working at full capacity, with no room for shocks. The second pressure is environmental degradation, and specifically deforestation. It's a strange irony that the cities now famous for being swallowed by jungle were, at their height, surrounded by almost no forest at all. Pollen records taken from lake sediments across the region show that by the late Classic period, the forests of the central Yucatan had been cleared on a massive scale, not just for agricultural land, but to fuel the production of lime plaster, an essential building material used to coat temples, plazas, and palace walls. Producing lime plaster requires burning enormous quantities of wood at very high, sustained temperatures, and the sheer scale of Maya construction during this period would have consumed forest at an industrial pace. Removing that forest cover had cascading effects. Exposed hillside soils eroded rapidly during the rainy season, washing nutrient-poor sediment down into valley floors and reducing the fertility of the very farmland that fed the growing population. At Copán, this process is especially well documented, as population pressure pushed settlement up onto the hillsides surrounding the main river valley in the 7th and 8th centuries. Deforestation there triggered exactly this kind of erosion, and skeletal remains from the period show rising rates of malnutrition and disease stress even before the city's final collapse. The third, and perhaps most decisive, pressure was climate. Sediment cores taken from lakes across the Yucatan, along with analysis of stalagmites and other paleoclimate proxies, point to a series of severe droughts beginning in the mid-8th century and intensifying into the 9th and 10th centuries. Some of the most severe dry periods the region had experienced in thousands of years. Ice cores from Greenland, thousands of miles away, independently confirm a dip in solar radiation output during roughly the same window, one plausible driver of shifts in the Atlantic trade wind patterns that deliver most of the Yucatan's rainfall. For a civilization already operating at the outer limits of what its agricultural and water storage systems could support, and already dealing with degraded soils and a shrinking forest buffer, a sustained multi-decade drought wasn't just an inconvenience, it was catastrophic. Crop failures on that scale, hitting a population with no historical experience of drought at that intensity, would have triggered exactly the kind of famine, social unrest, and desperate competition for remaining resources that the archaeological and skeletal evidence points to. When the system breaks, none of these three pressures, overpopulation, environmental degradation, and drought, would necessarily have been fatal on its own. Maya society had weathered droughts before and had centuries of accumulated knowledge about water management and agricultural resilience. What made the late 8th and 9th centuries different was that all three pressures arrived simultaneously, at the exact moment the political system had the least capacity to absorb the shock. Maya kingship rested on an implicit bargain. The king maintained a relationship with the gods that kept the sun moving, the rains falling, and the crops growing, and in exchange the population supported his court, his monuments, and his wars. This was a workable arrangement as long as the harvests came in. But when the rains failed and the harvests didn't come, that bargain became impossible to keep, and the legitimacy of the entire ruling class was called into question at exactly the same time. At Copán, the last recorded king came to power around 822 CE during what appears to have been a period of instability, and a monument begun in his honor was left half-finished, as though the project, and perhaps the institution of kingship itself, was simply abandoned mid-carving. Within decades, the royal palace there was burned. At other sites, archaeologists have found direct evidence of the chaos that followed. Burned buildings, deliberately smashed monuments, hastily built defensive walls constructed from looted temple stones, and caches of spearheads suggesting violent conflict. With central authority collapsing city by city, and no larger Maya state or empire to coordinate a response, each kingdom was left to fend for itself in a worsening environmental crisis, competing with its neighbors for dwindling farmland and water rather than cooperating to solve a shared problem. Refugees fleeing collapsing cities would have placed additional strain on neighboring cities that were often already struggling, creating a kind of cascading failure that spread outward from the initial epicenter of collapse in the southwest and rippled across the entire lowland region over the course of a century. What came after? The collapse of classic Maya civilization was not the end of the Maya people, a critical distinction that's often lost in popular retellings. Millions of Maya descendants live across Central America and southern Mexico today, and Maya languages are still spoken by several million people. What ended was a specific political and cultural system. The network of divine kingships, monumental urban centers, and long-count monument carving that had defined the classic period for over 5 centuries. In the decades and centuries after the major cities fell silent, most were not simply abandoned overnight. At Copán, for example, population estimates suggest the valley still held around half its peak population, a full century after the royal palace burned, with numbers only tapering off gradually over the following 2 centuries. Some poorer residents appear to have moved into the emptied palaces and temple complexes of the former elite, leaving behind layers of household debris in what had once been royal courtyards, and carving their own simple graffiti onto plastered walls that had once displayed royal propaganda. Remarkably, some of these later inhabitants appear to have continued venerating the old monuments as sacred objects, even without being able to read the hieroglyphic inscriptions on them. In some cases, moving carved stele to new locations and re-erecting them upside down, evidence that the specific meaning of the writing had already been lost even while the monuments themselves retained ritual significance. Crucially, none of the major Classic-era cities were ever meaningfully reoccupied at their former scale. The population that survived the collapse largely resettled elsewhere, some moving north into the Yucatan, where a somewhat different and more resilient set of Maya city-states, including Chichén Itzá and later Mayapan, would flourish for centuries after the southern lowlands fell quiet. It was these northern successor states, still very much alive and still very much Maya, that Spanish conquistadors and missionaries encountered when they arrived in the 16th century, by which point the great southern cities like Tikal and Calakmul had already been swallowed by secondary forest growth for 500 to 600 years, their existence unknown even to the Maya communities living in the same region. Conclusion. The story of the classic Maya collapse resists the kind of tidy, single-cause explanation that makes for a satisfying narrative. It wasn't conquest, and it wasn't a plague, and it wasn't a single drought or a single war. It was a slow accumulation of structural pressures, a population pushing against the hard limits of what its land and technology could support, an environment stripped of the forest cover that had buffered it against shocks, and a political system built entirely on the assumption that the rains would keep coming, all converging in a narrow, brutal window of decades. When the climate finally turned against them at the worst possible moment, the system didn't bend. It broke, city by city, in a wave that took less than a lifetime to cross an entire civilization.